Maria Johnson was sitting by the window in her small, sunlit kitchen, her hands gently resting on the swell of her belly. She was 8 months pregnant, and the soft kicks of her baby were the only thing grounding her in the moment as she sipped a cup of herbal tea. It was supposed to be a joyous time. Jamal, her husband, had painted the nursery in shades of lavender, and the baby's clothes, tiny onesies and booties, were already folded neatly in drawers. But as much as Maria wanted to focus on the joy of becoming a mother, something else gnawed at her, a deep, nagging fear. She had been dreaming about her mother lately, not the sweet, comforting dreams she used to have, but nightmares. In the dream, her mother was in a hospital bed, struggling to breathe, sweat beading on her forehead, her eyes wide with fear. Maria would stand frozen in the corner of the room, powerless to help as the heart monitor flatlined. She'd wake up gasping, clutching her own belly as if the baby could sense her terror.
"Don't be silly,"
Maria whispered to herself as she stood and rinsed her cup in the sink.
"Everything's going to be fine."
Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. Her mother had nearly died, giving birth to Maria's youngest brother, and her grandmother had lost 2 babies during childbirth. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a pattern, a history that weighed heavily on her. Maria had spoken to her doctor about her concerns at her last prenatal appointment, but he had brushed her off, telling her not to worry.
"You're young, healthy. There's nothing to be concerned about,"
Dr. Sullivan had said with a dismissive smile, but there was something about the way he had said it, so detached, so uninterested, that left Maria feeling uneasy. She had heard stories from other women in her neighborhood about the way black patients were treated differently in hospital, but she hadn't wanted to believe it, not until now.
"Maria."
Jamal's voice called from the living room. He appeared in the doorway, his face softening as he looked at her.
"You okay, baby?"
Maria forced a smile. Jamal had been working extra shifts at the auto plant, saving up for when the baby came. His brown eyes were tired, but they still held that warmth she loved.
"Yeah, I'm fine.
She lied, reaching out for his hand.
Just a little nervous about the appointment."
"You want me to come with you?"
Jamal asked, stepping closer and wrapping his arms around her. His hands rested protectively on her belly.
"I wish you could, but I know you've got work."
Maria replied, leaning into his embrace.
"I'll be okay. It's just a checkup."
Jamal kissed the top of her head, lingering for a moment before pulling back.
"I'll be thinking about you all day. You call me if anything happens, all right?"
"I will."
As Jamal left for work, Maria stood for a moment in the silence of the apartment, her hand still resting on her belly. She felt the baby move again, flutter of life beneath her skin, and for a fleeting second, her worries vanished. But as soon as the door clicked shut behind Jamal, they came rushing back. Her prenatal appointment was in a few hours, and even though she had done everything the doctors had told her, eating right, taking vitamins, attending every single checkup, there was still a knot of fear in her chest that wouldn't go away. Maria picked up her phone, scrolling through old messages from her mother, who had passed away 5 months earlier. She found one from the day she had told her mom she was pregnant. It read,
"You're going to be a wonderful mother, Maria. Just don't forget to trust yourself. You know more than you think."
Her mother's words had given her strength then, and now they felt like a lifeline. Maria packed her bag and made her way to the hospital. St. Mary's was an older building, its sterile white walls making the place feel more like a relic than a modern medical center. As she walked through the revolving doors, the familiar scent of disinfectant filled her nose, sending a shiver down her spine. She had been here so many times in the past few months, but today felt different, heavier, more uncertain. The waiting room was already crowded when she arrived, filled with women in various stages of pregnancy, all cradling their bellies or flipping through magazines. Maria sat down in the corner, trying to distract herself with a pamphlet about prenatal care. Every few minutes, a nurse would call out a name, and another woman would be whisked away to see a doctor. Maria couldn't help but notice that the white women seemed to get called back sooner. She watched as a nurse called out a name, and a blonde woman, who had arrived after Maria, stood and was led to the exam rooms. Maria looked down at her own hands, her dark skin contrasting sharply with the pale, sterile surroundings of the hospital. She tried not to let it bother her, but it did. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse finally called her name.
"Maria Johnson."
Maria stood up, smoothing her shirt over her belly as she followed the nurse down the hallway. The walls were lined with posters of smiling mothers and babies, but Maria's stomach churned with anxiety. She was led into an exam room and instructed to sit on the table. The nurse took her vitals, blood pressure, pulse, temperature, and jotted down some notes on her clipboard without making much eye contact.
"The doctor will be in shortly,"
the nurse said. Her voice clipped. She exited the room, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. Minutes passed. Maria sat on the edge of the examination table, her legs dangling as she glanced nervously at the clock. 15 minutes went by, then 30. Maria's anxiety mounted with every passing second. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if something was wrong with the baby? What if her blood pressure was too high? What if the doctor missed something crucial? She got up, pacing the small room, trying to shake off the nerves. But as more time ticked by, her frustration grew. Finally, after almost 45 minutes, the door creaked open, and Dr. Sullivan walked in.
Sorry about the wait.
He said, though his tone didn't carry a hint of sincerity. He barely looked up from the tablet in his hands as he scanned her chart.
Let's see here. How are we feeling today?
Maria swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady.
I've been feeling really tired lately, and I've had some swelling in my feet and hands. I told you at my last appointment that I was worried about preeclampsia. My mom had it with my youngest brother, and
Dr. Sullivan waved his hand dismissively.
I remember. But like I said before, there's nothing to worry about. Swelling is normal during pregnancy.
Maria felt a surge of frustration.
but it's not just swelling. I've been having headaches, and I'm seeing spots sometimes. I looked it up online, and it said those could be signs.
Look,
Dr. Sullivan interrupted, his eyes finally meeting hers, but with an expression that was more of annoyance than concern.
you're a healthy young woman. These symptoms aren't unusual, especially this late in pregnancy. If it were anything serious, we would have caught it by now.
Maria felt her stomach twist. How could he be so sure without even running any tests? She had heard other women who looked like her, talk about how doctors often ignored their concerns, but she had hoped it wouldn't happen to her.
But I really think
She began again, her voice growing more urgent. Dr. Sullivan sighed and glanced at his watch.
I'll order some routine blood work just to ease your mind, but I'm telling you, you're fine. Everything is going to be fine.
With that, he stood and scribbled something on his tablet before walking toward the door.
A nurse will be in to take your blood. We'll call you with the results in a few days.
Maria opened her mouth to protest, to ask for more tests, more reassurance, but the door closed before she could say anything. She sat there, the silence in the room now deafening, her heart pounding in her chest. A heavy weight settled in her stomach, an instinct she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. That night, as Maria lay in bed beside Jamal, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the doctor's words. Everything is fine, he had said. But she didn't feel fine. Her body didn't feel fine. She felt off. Jamal turned over, sensing her restlessness.
You're still worried, aren't you?
He had said. He asked softly, his voice thick with sleep. Maria nodded, her hand resting on her belly.
I don't know, Jamal. Something doesn't feel right. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't shake this feeling that something's wrong. Dr. Sullivan acted like I was overreacting, but what if I'm not?
Jamal reached over, taking her hand in his.
You know your body better than anyone else, Maria. If you think something's wrong, we'll go back tomorrow and demand they take you seriously. You're not overreacting.
Maria exhaled, her chest tightening as tears welled up in her eyes.
I don't want to be a burden. I know you've been working so hard, and I don't want to make things more stressful.
Hey,
Jamal said, his voice firm but gentle.
you and this baby are my priority. Nothing else matters more than that. If you need to go back to the hospital, we'll go. First thing in the morning.
Maria nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for the man beside her. But even as she tried to calm herself, a nagging sense of dread clung to her. She wanted to believe everything would be fine, that Dr. Sullivan's dismissiveness was just his poor bedside manner, and not a sign that something was being overlooked. Deep down, she knew she had to trust her instincts. The next morning, Maria woke up with a pounding headache. The sunlight streaming through the bedroom window felt too bright, and the slightest movement made her feel nauseous. Jamal had already left for work, leaving her a note on the kitchen table, reminding her to call him if she felt unwell. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her as she shuffled to the bathroom. As she splashed cold water on her face, her reflection in the mirror startled her. Her eyes were puffy, and the swelling in her face was worse than the night before. Her feet and ankles were still bloated, and now even her fingers felt tight, as though her skin was stretching too thin. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her contacts, and found the number for the hospital. The nurse who answered was polite but quick.
Dr. Sullivan reviewed your chart, and your blood work hasn't come back yet. You're still scheduled for your follow-up next week, so we'll see you then, unless there's an emergency.
Maria bit her lip, trying to steady her voice.
But what if I'm having signs of preeclampsia? I'm seeing spots, and
You should rest and try to keep your feet elevated.
The nurse interrupted.
If your symptoms get worse, come in. Otherwise, wait for the test results.
The nurse's tone mirrored Dr. Sullivan's indifference, and Maria felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. Was she overreacting, or was something seriously wrong? Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was Jamal.
Hey, babe.
She answered, her voice shaky.
You doing okay?
Jamal asked, his concern evident even through the phone.
I just wanted to check in.
Maria hesitated, torn between wanting to reassure him and telling him how bad she really felt.
I don't know, Jamal. I called the hospital, but they said to wait. But I don't think I can. Something's wrong. I can feel it.
Jamal's voice was steady but tense.
I'm coming home. We're going to the hospital. Don't move. Just sit down and rest. I'll be there in 30 minutes, Maria.
Maria wanted to argue, to tell him not to leave work early, but the urgency in his voice left no room for debate. She hung up, lowering herself onto the couch, but even sitting still, she felt her heart racing. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she blinked, trying to clear the spots that danced in front of her eye. When Jamal arrived, he found Maria slumped on the couch, her skin pale and clammy. His heart clenched in fear as he rushed to her side, gently lifting her into his arm.
We're going to the hospital now.
Maria nodded weakly, the fight draining out of her. She was too tired to argue. Every muscle in her body ached, and the headache throbbed in her temples. Jamal helped her into the car and sped towards St. Mary's, his mind racing with every mile. He didn't want to think the worst, but with every glance at Maria's pained expression, it became harder to push the fear away. They reached the hospital, and Jamal practically carried Maria through the sliding doors. The waiting room was busier than the day before, but this time, Jamal wasn't willing to wait. He strode up to the nurse's station, his voice steady but forceful.
My wife is really sick. She's been having symptoms for days, and we need to see a doctor now.
The nurse at the desk looked up, her eyes flicking over Maria before returning to her computer screen.
Have you already spoken to a doctor?
She asked, her tone matter of fact.
Yes, but no one's taking this seriously.
Jamal said, his frustration rising.
We think it's preeclampsia.
The nurse sighed and clicked a few buttons on her keyboard.
You're not scheduled for a follow-up until next week. If you could just take a seat, we'll see if a doctor can fit her in.
Maria swayed on her feet, her hand clutching Jamal's arm for support. He felt her weight shift and glanced down at her, panic rising in his chest. Maria's skin had gone a pale, sickly hue, and her eyes were half-lidded, barely able to stay open.
No, you don't understand.
Jamal's voice cracked, his calm veneer crumbling.
She's not fine. She needs help right now. Please just get someone to see her.
The nurse gave them a long, cold look before picking up the phone.
I'll call someone.
She muttered, her tone devoid of urgency. Jamal helped Maria to a chair, his heart racing. He could feel his pulse in his temples, frustration and fear tightening his chest. He sat beside her, gripping her hand as her head rested against his shoulder. She was barely conscious now, her breath shallow. Minutes passed, and still, no one came. Jamal stood up and paced the room, glancing down the hallway every few seconds, praying someone would come to their aid. When a nurse finally appeared, she took one look at Maria and called for a gurney. They rushed her into a room where Dr. Sullivan, the same doctor who had dismissed Maria's concerns before, was waiting. His expression was impassive as he examined her, making notes on his tablet.
She's in distress.
The nurse reported.
Severe swelling, possible preeclampsia.
Dr. Sullivan barely glanced at Maria.
We'll need to run more tests.
He said curtly, but Jamal could sense the lack of urgency in his voice. Maria's vision blurred again, and this time she couldn't fight the darkness that crept into the corners of her mind. Her breathing became labored, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Jamal's heart pounded as he watched her struggle, helpless.
You need to do something.
Jamal shouted, stepping closer to Dr. Sullivan.
Look at her. She's dying.
Dr. Sullivan finally raised an eyebrow at Jamal, his lips pressed in a thin line.
Sir, I understand you're concerned, but these things take time. We'll run some blood work and...
No,
Jamal snapped.
she doesn't have time. Do you not see her? She's slipping away and you're standing here like it's nothing.
Dr. Sullivan straightened his posture, his face unreadable.
If you don't calm down, I'll have security escort you out.
Jamal's vision went red. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand someone take them seriously. But before he could say anything, another voice cut through the tension.
What's going on in here?
It was Dr. Mercer, an older, more experienced physician who had a reputation for being thorough. She took one look at Maria, and her demeanor changed immediately. She barked orders to the nurses, who sprang into action, prepping Maria for an emergency delivery.
We need to get this baby out now.
Dr. Mercer said as she examined Maria.
Her blood pressure is through the roof and her organs are failing. If we don't act quickly, Both she and the baby could die.
The words hit Jamal like a freight train. He felt his legs give out beneath him as he stumbled back into the chair. His whole world was collapsing. The next few hours were a blur of chaos. Nurses rushing in and out, doctors giving orders, machines beeping incessantly. Jamal stood by Maria's side, gripping her hand, praying harder than he ever had in his life.
She's going to make it.
He whispered over and over to himself, trying to convince himself it was true.
They're going to save her.
But deep down, a part of him knew the truth. He could see it in the doctors' faces, in the frantic movements of the nurses. Time was running out. Hours later, Jamal sat in the waiting room, his head buried in his hands. He had been asked to leave the room as they performed the emergency C-section. The sterile white walls seemed to close in on him, the smell of antiseptic making his stomach churn. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. When Dr. Mercer finally emerged, her face grim, Jamal's heart dropped into his stomach.
We managed to deliver the baby.
She said, her voice soft but filled with the weight of what she was about to say.
But Maria, she didn't make it.
Jamal's world shattered. The air left his lungs as if he had been punched in the gut.
No.
He whispered, shaking his head in disbelief.
No, no, no. This can't be happening.
Dr. Mercer placed a hand on his shoulder, but Jamal barely felt it. The numbness had already taken over.
We did everything we could, but her organs were shutting down by the time we got her into surgery. I'm so sorry.
The words rang in his ears, but they didn't feel real. How could Maria be gone? She was just here, holding his hand, telling him everything would be okay. How could she be gone? The sound of a baby crying pierced the fog in Jamal's mind. He turned, his eyes focusing on the nurse holding a tiny, wriggling bundle wrapped in a pink blanket.
Your daughter is healthy.
The nurse said gently, walking over to Jamal and placing the baby in his arms.
She's a fighter, just like her mother.
Jamal stared down at the newborn, his heart breaking and swelling all at once. She had Maria's eyes, her tiny nose, his beautiful baby girl. But Maria wasn't here to see her. She wasn't here to hold her. Tears streamed down Jamal's face as he cradled his daughter. How was he supposed to do this alone? How was he supposed to raise this child without the woman he loved by his side? In the days following Maria's death, Jamal was consumed with grief. But as the initial shock began to wear off, grief was replaced by something else, anger. He replayed every moment in the hospital in his mind, every dismissive word from Dr. Sullivan, every time he had brushed Maria's concerns aside. Maria had known something was wrong. She had begged for someone to listen, and no one had. They had let her die. Jamal couldn't let it go. He refused to let Maria's death be just another statistic, another woman of color failed by the medical system. He reached out to an attorney and began the long, painful process of filing a lawsuit against the hospital. Dr. Sullivan had to answer for his negligence. Weeks turned into months as the case wound through the courts. Other women came forward, sharing their own stories of being mistreated or ignored by Dr. Sullivan. The hospital tried to cover it up, but the truth couldn't be buried forever. The trial was brutal, and Jamal relived the worst day of his life over and over again, but he refused to give up. He wasn't just fighting for Maria, he was fighting for every woman who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. In the end, the jury ruled in Jamal's favor. Dr. Sullivan lost his medical license, and the hospital was held accountable for its role in Maria's death, but no amount of money or justice could bring Maria back. As Jamal stood in the courtroom, holding his daughter in his arms, he looked down at her tiny face and felt a surge of determination. He would make sure she grew up knowing how strong and brave her mother had been, and he would never stop fighting for her, for Maria, and for all the women who came after her. The battle wasn't over, but Maria's story wouldn't end in silence. If you enjoyed this story, please support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next story.